As Ahmad said, I'm Andrea Johnson. I actually live in Leavenworth, Kansas. I generally have worked on Democratic campaigns, and a lot of my perspective is from Democratic campaigns, but I'm happy to answer a lot of questions that apply to whatever party or whatever place on the political spectrum you want to run. I first started working in campaigns in 1999 when Bill Bradley ran for president, and have worked on, oh golly, either on or around 5 presidential campaigns and Senate campaigns and gubernatorial campaigns all over the country. There was a period where I lived in 10 different states in 10 years, going from state to state to work on different campaigns and different organizations. I currently work for Run for Something, which is a group that is a progressive group. It's a PAC, a national PAC that encourages young people to run for office, particularly local and state office, and endorses candidates. The candidates we endorse are progressive, 40 or under, running for the first or second time in down ballot races. And for us, down ballot races mean state Senate and down. So we don't endorse in federal races like US Congress, US Senate, and we don't endorse in statewide races like governor or secretary of state. But basically anything with a district on down the ballot, we endorse it, including, there are places where coroner is on the ballot. We'll endorse in those races, water board, you name it, definitely school board, city council, state legislature, that kind of thing. So if you are a progressive and you're under 40 and you're running for the first or second time, you should reach out to me, and I'll give you my email address at the end to find out more about running for office and getting our endorsement. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to discuss today. We're going to talk a little bit about understanding why running for office is important. Some of this might be a little rudimentary for you, so if it feels like that, you're welcome to tell me in the chat and I can speed it up. Who should consider running, and then get a sense of what it takes to win and some of the things that you might want to be thinking about if you're considering running for office. And if we have folks on the call today that are more advanced and need more sort of 2.0 answers to questions, I'm totally open to that too. This is sort of designed more for folks that are just getting introduced to the idea of running for office, but I'm willing to answer any questions you have. Okay, so let's start with why running for office is important. I know that in this time, politics can feel kind of cynical sometimes, or like it's hard for real change to happen, but I hope that everyone embraces the idea that politics are important and the work that our government does is critical. I think this last year has really put truth to that, to anyone who doubted it. I also think that it's also really critical to think about local offices where major change can happen. The reality is, in our country, in all countries, change doesn't just happen. The powers of status quo are strong. When you see something that needs to change, frankly, wishing and hoping someone else will do it isn't enough. Sometimes looking to others to take your issues seriously and make the change you think needs to happen isn't enough. Sometimes it means that you need to step in, or your friends or family need to step in and take on a leadership role to make the changes that you feel like your community needs. Passivity sometimes just isn't the right path when you have real change that needs to happen. Another thing about why running is important is that politics is a team sport, both running for office as well as legislating. Sometimes politics seems like it's just individuals pitted against other individuals, but in reality, to get things done and to get elected, you need coalitions. So it isn't enough to elect one person with a good idea. You need a whole group. Just electing one person that's a good representative of your community isn't sufficient. You need to elect multiple people at different levels of government to get things done and to advocate for the issues that your community cares about and make the change that matters to you. So it's not just enough to elect one person either at the federal level or at the local level. We need lots of people to make change happen, especially when you have something in particular that your community is fighting for. Another thing that's important is a lot of people ask me, I live in a very Republican area, or I live in a district that has been, all Democratic for a decade. Why should I run if it's not clear that I can win, or that it's unlikely I will win? One thing that I think is important to remember is that not winning isn't a loss in campaign. Campaigns build over time. Districts that are unwinnable one year change. Demographics change, the people running change, the issues at hand change. But the other thing that's true is that campaigns build on each other. One year you find a certain number of donors and a certain number of volunteers that may not be a huge quantity, but might be high quality. And the next campaign that runs in that district has a chance to build on that and get a few more donors and a few more volunteers. There also is such a thing as a culture of giving and a culture of volunteering that builds over time, where people that maybe had never volunteered on a campaign in their life start to, because there's an issue they really care about or a candidate they really connect to. And that starts building a culture of volunteering or a culture of donating that helps fuel not just the future campaigns, but also organizations fighting for change in that community and other groups doing good work. And so building that infrastructure and building that path forward is really critical. And as I said, I can't emphasize this enough, each campaign really does build on the other. So sometimes you have to be the first one to lay the foundational blocks so that the next person running has a little bit more of a base to run on. It's also true that lots and lots of candidates don't win their first election. That, people that run for president don't win their first election. So sometimes it takes a campaign or two to build up the name recognition and to build up the support that really leads you to a win. The other thing that I think that's important in general about challenging powers that be and structures is that when we have unchallenged structures, that tends to lead to extremism and really insulated policymaking that's not very representative of our communities. One reason why challenging is important, even if it doesn't lead to a win, is it makes incumbents take into account the entire breadth of their community and the entire range of issues that matter to their community, and not sort of lean towards extremism or lean towards just serving a few and rather they're serving the many. So let's talk about who should run. We'll talk more about some of the things that you need to run successfully in a minute, but who should run? People that should run for office can really run the whole range of society. I mean, we work mostly with young people, and I would encourage you, if you're young, to really think about running. There is often a sense that a politician needs to look a certain way or have a certain experience. Like, for example, they need to be a white guy over 55 who's a lawyer, and that just isn't true. People from all kinds of different experiences that represent all kinds of different communities run for office and win. And again, the challenge is just as important as the win. Expanding what candidates look like and what they talk about is really critical for getting good policy and building a good political ecosystem. So when we think about who should run, I really think you should consider running for office. So we'll talk some more about why that is and what that means. First of all, representation matters. Good representation matters. So representation that reflects the entire breadth of the communities that are being representative in that body of government is critical, that everybody has a voice and that all voices are heard. It especially matters for the people that, not just us, but for the people that come behind us. It is very difficult to imagine a career in politics if you've never seen someone that looks like you or comes from your community who's run and succeeded, or at least has run. So running for office really matters just for good representation, but also to build that sense of possibility for the people that come behind us. The other reason why you should consider running is because diversity in politics isn't just a goal of optics. Good policy is the product of a range of opinions and experiences that meld together to make policy that's good for everyone. Bad policy is the product of just a few viewpoints that only serve those that are the most similar. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this in your community. We've definitely seen this at the national level, but diversity in perspective is critical for good policy. So let's talk about what is involved with running. I'm not going to lie to you. Running for office isn't easy. It takes a lot of work. It takes some vulnerability. It tends to be very anxiety inducing. It can be hard to do, but you can do it. I have candidates that I work with, and I didn't say this earlier, but the primary thing I do for Run for Something is I'm a regional director, which means that I coach candidates all over the country, in particular in the western half of the country, on their campaigns. That means I give strategic advice and give suggestions about messaging and read mail pieces and do all of that kind of support work to help people run for office. And Run for Something is not the only group that does this work. There's a range of groups working in Arizona, working around the country that help people run for office and run for office well. So you'll have help, and you definitely can do it. Again, I'm not going to mislead you. Running for office is kind of like having another job, and most of our candidates have a full-time job or are taking care of their families, but they spend all of their extra time on campaigning. That means going to meetings, raising money, recruiting and managing volunteers, creating plans to win. There can be a fair number of moving pieces in a campaign, but you recruit a team to help. That's one of the ways that you become successful, is by recruiting a team to help. So you have people that help you, but it's also important to say that no one really does it for you. There is no sort of magic list of donors that will automatically fund your campaign, or a volunteer list that you get from the party that is suddenly a pre-made volunteer program. And running for office also means that you sometimes have to do things that you're not super comfortable with first, like asking for money. You absolutely can ask for money and be a successful fundraiser, but a lot of people feel a little shy about that when they first think about it. Another thing that's true about running for office is that you have to go public. People see your name on ads or on signs, and being out in the public, especially representing a party, gets a range of response, and sometimes it's not very nice response. I'm not going to lie to you. I have candidates in Arizona and around the country that have confronted racism and xenophobia, as well as just run-of-the-mill incivility. Something about politics sometimes makes people feel like they can say and should say things that they wouldn't say in their everyday relationships. But I don't want to list all of the bad things that can happen without telling you that it's very, very doable. I mean, last cycle I had 200 candidates, and 70% of them won their races. And those are candidates that really ran the range. In Arizona alone, I had school board candidates that raised $3,000 or $5,000 for their whole campaign, and candidates that raised $30,000. I've had candidates that raised $2,000 for the whole campaign, and candidates that raise $1 million. So there's a place for you in the system. And while it takes a lot of work, it is all very doable work. One thing that I want to emphasize is that if you don't have any experience doing campaign work, that shouldn't be a hurdle for you to get involved and give it a shot. Campaigning does take a lot of work. It does take a lot of time and energy, but at its core, it's not complicated. You really are just creating 3 lists of people. You're creating a list of donors, of whom you're asking for money to help support your campaign and buy mail pieces and buy yard signs and put up digital ads. You're creating a list of people that could volunteer and asking them to give time to help you reach voters or help you reach donors or help you do things like maintain your social media or manage your volunteers. And then you're creating a list of voters of whom you're asking for their vote. And you're using that money that you raised and you're using that volunteer time that you've gathered to reach those voters and hopefully put you over the top on election day. So the mechanics aren't complicated, but it does take quite a bit of work. But there are lots of groups out there that will help you run. This list is a little bit more progressive. I can't really rattle off a list for you of the groups that are in the conservative space, but there's a whole ecosystem of the same that have groups that will help support you run. That includes friends and family in your community. There's also party infrastructure, where it's a state party, the county party, legislative district party groups. There are issue groups and PACs like Run for Something. There's a variety of those that work on different issues and that support candidates. There's also training groups and candidate support groups out there. There's several listed here. Emerge in Arizona list work with women candidates. The National Democratic Training Committee has a lot of training materials that are available for free and do free virtual trainings on the whole range of tactics and skills you need to run a successful campaign. And Arena does trainings for campaign staffers that can be very effective. So there's a lot of groups that are out there that will help. And running for local office is a great place to start when you're thinking about a political future, because local offices are smaller races that are often easier to win, many of which are nonpartisan, and they can have a big impact. I mean, when we think about the last year with COVID, it was often local offices that are figuring out the health plans for a county or for a city, that are doing things like mask ordinances or figuring out when schools are going to open. So local offices are a great place to start, and they're a great place to have a huge impact on your community. So let's talk a little bit about what it takes to win. Because even if you're a building year and a building campaign, everyone should be fighting to win the campaigns that they work on. To win, you need four things. You need a plan. You can't just sort of do it ad hoc. And the groups I mentioned before and the resources online can help you put together that plan, but you need a plan that helps you figure out who are the voters I'm going to talk to, how am I going to talk to them, when am I going to talk to them, what is my plan for social media, what is my plan for fundraising, so that you have a plan that you can execute to win. Winning a campaign also takes passion. You need to care about your community and ideally have strongly held values that animate your run. And people need to know that you care and that what you're advocating for is rooted in those strongly held values and experiences. So you need a passion. You also need a purpose, that there's a specific change you want to see, that there's a policy change or a structural change that you want for your community or that your community needs, that you are going to fight for when you're elected. Ideally, you also need something that sets you apart from your opponents, and often that is the specific policies or the specific change that you want to see. And finally, you need to be part of the community. You need to be part of the community both so you have a base of support, but also so that you know what the community needs and wants. That means building ties with community, learning the issues that matter to people in your community, in your city, in your town, going to meetings, finding out what the issues of the day are and where the elected officials stand on those issues, meeting opinion leaders and getting guidance from them about what issues they care about or what groups are fighting for. So being part of the community is also a critical piece to winning. One thing that I talked a little bit about before, but that's important to sort of orient your mind around when you're thinking about campaigning, is that you're going to be asking for lots of things. Lots of campaigning is about asking for help. And sometimes this feels a little uncomfortable to people at first, especially asking for money. But A, you'll get used to it, and B, it's absolutely necessary. You're going to be asking for money, you're going to be asking for volunteers, you're going to be asking for votes. A lot of times people feel uncomfortable about asking for money because it feels like they're asking for themselves. But the reality is you're not. You're asking for a vision of change. You're asking people to invest in a vision for what the community needs and what policy changes you need to be successful. So you're asking people to invest in something larger than you and something that is absolutely a service for the community. And when you orient your head around that, it makes asking for money easier. But I will tell you, there are no quick fixes in raising money. It means making lots of phone calls. Very few campaigns can raise the money they need just by email and social media. Usually you have to talk to people. In non-pandemic times, that might mean talking to groups or having events, also having virtual events, but it also means calling people up, even people you don't know, and asking for money. It also means building a volunteer base that are friends and family and community members that can help you both with contacting voters and reaching the voters you need to win, but who also will take on roles to help your campaign. They may take on helping you do social media content so you can keep up with the steady stream of content you need on social media, or they may take on managing volunteers, or they may take on helping you with fundraising research or call time. They may even be like a volunteer campaign manager. So you'll need to build up that base to help you win. Another piece about winning is telling your story. And this isn't just picking the issues that you care about. It's about incorporating storytelling and narrative that makes your message more effective. When you're getting started on your campaign, you'll want to really think about what the story of self is that tells the story of why you're running and why you should be elected. That's the story of where your values come from, the experience and events that you've had in your life that have led you to fight for the issues that you care about, and the experiences that have prepared you to lead in your community. That's your story of why am I running? Why am I running for this office? Why I should be elected. You also want a story of us, which is the story of the community, about the issues that matter to the community and where those issues come from, why those issues matter now, what are the values that animate the community and are most important to your neighbors and family members, and what does the community need and want, and why are you the right person to help make those changes happen. So your core message should really be a narrative about who you are and what's brought you to this point, and who the community is and why they need this change. There are lots of other messaging exercises and messaging work that goes into running a good campaign, but you want to start with that kernel of the story of why I'm running, your story of self, and the story of us. So let's talk briefly about some of the things you should be thinking about if, from this presentation or for other things, you're thinking, maybe I really will consider running for office. What are some of the first things that you should do and be thinking about? One of the first things you should be thinking about is, what race do you want to run in? What office do you want to run for? A lot of people are like, oh, maybe I'll run for Congress, or maybe I'll run for county commission. I would encourage you to start by thinking about, what do you want to change? If what you really want to change or have an influence on is, expanding curriculum in the schools, then school board might be the place you want to start. If what you're really animated about is, issues around infrastructure and sort of, road building and bridges, or quality of plumbing or infrastructure in your community, you might want to look at county commission offices and some city councils. If what you're concerned about are state rules for Medicaid and those things, then state legislature might be a good office for you. So start with what your passion is. And remember that local offices are a great place to start. There are absolutely people who their first campaign is running for Congress and they win, but that sometimes, sometimes building a base with a smaller office can make those bigger offices down the road be more accessible. The next thing you should do is doing your homework, figuring out when the filing deadlines are for that office and what it takes to file, figuring out information about, what it takes to set up a bank account. I mean, none of these things are hard, and all that information is available online, but doing your homework. It also means getting information about how much money people have raised when they've run for this office before, to give you a sense of how much money you'll need to raise. You can get that through publicly available campaign finance records that candidates file and tell you how much they've raised and how much they've spent. You also want to do your homework about who are the community leaders and groups that are working around the issues that you care about, or that are working to elect people in your community. The next thing you want to do is build your network. That means going to meetings. Like if you're running to sit for city council, one of the first things you should do is go to some city council meetings to figure out what they talk about, and make sure that they're doing the kind of work that you want to do. It means meeting with the party and meeting with the sort of party electoral officials in your community. It's also talking to other groups. Hopefully you already have some of those community connections, but who else is working on the issues that you care about in your community? Some of them might be chapters of national groups. Some of them might be local groups that have formed. Another piece of building that network is telling people that you're thinking about running. This is important for you to be successful, because if people know that there's a strong candidate running for that seat, they're less likely to get into the race, which makes campaigning a little bit easier to actually win. The next thing that you want to do is build your team. You will want to start with kind of a kitchen cabinet. Who are the key helpers in your life? It might be a spouse or a partner. It might be a best friend or a sibling. or it just might be even a colleague or someone else that you work with. These are your sort of key advisors and are likely to take on some of the volunteer leadership roles in your campaign. Things like working on social media, as I mentioned before, helping with volunteers, or helping you with fundraising, or helping you plan events. So you want to start building that team and start recruiting those volunteer leaders that will help distribute the work of your campaign, but also get people invested in your campaign. The next thing that you want to do, and I sort of probably should switch 5 and 6, but you will want to build an initial web presence. This doesn't have to be big and exotic and elaborate, but about the time you start asking money for especially for people that don't know you, you want something online that they can look you up and see that you're a credible, serious campaign. So you want a basic website that looks professional and basic social media presence. It doesn't mean you need to have social media accounts on every social media platform out there, but you probably want to start for sure with a Facebook account and maybe a Twitter account. And if you have the time and the energy, then maybe Instagram. But you want to sort of have some basic social media in place and a basic website. This is especially important when you start asking people for money who don't have a personal relationship with you, so they can check and make sure that you're a serious campaign that's running a professional race. Again, they can be simple, but you'll need things to do it well. You'll need some high quality photographs. You'll need to do a logo, which again can be very simple. It doesn't mean you need a professional to do it. It doesn't have to be hard or complicated, but you might need some help for doing that. And then the next thing that you'll want to start as early as possible is asking people for money to start building both the resources you need in your campaign, but also the credibility that you're running a strong campaign and that it's worth it for other people to invest in. Okay, I've been talking for golly, almost 40 minutes. Do you all have any questions for me?
We do have some questions, but I want to first say thank you so much, Andrea, for all this great information. And one thing that you hit on a little bit earlier that I just wanted to mention about, I appreciate that you brought up, some of the hardships that come up with running for office, because I think there is a lot of energy in our community of maybe wanting to do this, but maybe not seeing the full picture. But like you said, just because you lose an election doesn't mean it's a loss completely. There's still a base building and everything going forward. So we do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
The first one is something you kind of mentioned, is if you have a strong passion for one thing, how do you become a more well-rounded candidate, like for a city council or something? You might, like you said, if school is your passion, want a better curriculum, how do you balance that with like actually legislating or planning a budget?
A great place to start is to go to some of the meetings of the office that you want to participate in. It's also about reading the news. I mean, there are communities like where I live in Kansas, the school board gets covered in the local paper, but the state legislature doesn't. So I have to kind of poke around to find news about what the state legislature is doing more. But reading those sorts of resources, there's almost always newspapers, there's also often blogs, there's Twitter accounts that talk about what local government is doing. So finding those and finding the sort of opinion leaders that talk about those issues. Another thing that's helpful is talking to, if you are a member of a group, like for example, let's say you're really interested in environmental issues, talk to the people that are also members of that group about what other groups they're members of, because people that are sort of members of one group tend to be members of multiple groups and have an idea of what other groups are working in the community on different issues. And then reach out to either members of those groups or leaders of those groups to talk about, how does your issue affect city council, or what does city council's decisions lately impact the issue you care about, or even what do you think the city council should be doing to be more effective around climate change, or to be more effective around green energy, or whatever that issue is that you care about.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Another question that's similar to that one is, how do you get the experience for running? I know a lot of people who are first-time runners, that's the thing, that the knock against them, they're not experienced. Yeah. So how do you get that experience to, say that I could be in this position?
Well, I work with a lot of young candidates, and I mean candidates that are, 18, 19 years
Okay.
old. So they get, young candidates get hit a lot for not having enough experience, or, not having enough experience is a big one. And that's often kind of a placeholder for saying you're too young. Um, there are all kinds of ways to establish credibility and experience. One is knowing your business. I mean, knowing the issues and being able to talk. You don't have to know every detail or the entire historical record of every vote taken on that issue ever, but knowing the basic um, parameters of the issue, the way that issue has played out recently in your community, and having that information and speaking about it confidently is a big piece of it. It helps to have been members of groups and parts of community groups for a couple reasons. One is that helps build up your base of support, but it also tells people that you are invested in the community. It's a lot harder to run for office, especially if you don't have any experience in electoral politics, if you cannot say, I'm a member of these groups, or I've been invested in these issues and I've been working on these things for a while. It's harder to be like, I am not a member of any group, I don't know anybody, but I'm running for office. It's harder to build up that sense of credibility. So that's another piece. But a big piece of it is also just, even if it's fake it till you make it, having the confidence that you absolutely are a viable candidate, regardless of what they say. Because people will try to undermine you. But the reality is that every politician that exists had a first campaign where they'd never been elected before. Joe Biden, who's been in government for 40 odd years, had a first campaign where he had no experience. So every candidate has that. And there are plenty of people. I mean, heck, there are people that run for president and are successful and have no political experience. So, there absolutely is a place for you, even if you've never been elected before. And that's also one reason why local offices can be oftentimes people that are running for school board have never had an elected office before. City council often have never had an elected office before. So that's less of a hurdle for you in those kinds of races.
Those are all good points. One thing that I just want to add that you brought up, especially at the local level, is that these races are won by, a couple thousand votes, maybe even less than, maybe just a little bit.
Tens of votes, hundreds of votes. Yeah.
So sometimes it's even like, how can I win this? And it's just like the house next door could swing the whole election for that community. Yeah. So it's accessible, and I appreciate your words. The next question is, if you don't have a big budget, what's the best way to advertise yourself? Is it digital? Is it the radio, if you have those funds, or is it just like a lit drop?
A lot of it depends on your district. Mail can be effective, but it's also pretty expensive. The nice thing about mail is it's very targeted. You can figure out, exactly which candidates you want to speak to with that message and send that mail to them. The other thing that's an advantage about mail is that, unlike a phone call or a door knock, most people will at least look at that mail piece for 15 seconds or 20 seconds, whereas, they don't always answer the phone or answer the door. Digital ads can be very effective, and there's also a lot of targeting that's available for digital ads. For lots of smaller races, TV isn't particularly effective because with just broadcast television, it's not as targeted. There's targeting. I'm not an expert on targeting of TV ads, but there's targeting you can do through, cable networks and targeting like to specific shows and specific channels that you can do, and also demographic targeting through cable. But it tends to be, like, for example, I'm not an expert on it because it tends to require sort of expertise to do it well. It's not something that's easy for just someone with no experience to pick up and do that kind of targeting. And it tends to be really expensive, and the production costs are really high for TV. Radio has some of the same issues. I mean, radio, there are some communities, especially in, say, rural communities or community specific radio, like Spanish language radio, that can be effective for political ads in some communities and cost effective. But a lot of times, a radio station, like if you're running for school board, if you're running for CAIR-AZ School Board and you buy a radio spot on, one of the larger Phoenix radio stations, you're mostly talking to people that aren't your voters.
Yeah.
And so you're spending most of your money on people that can't vote for you. And that's not a very targeted way to use your money. But digital ads can be targeted. Digital ads aren't as effective as conversations for persuading voters, but they can be effective for raising money, and they can be effective for getting votes out, getting people to vote. And we're finding more effectiveness in them to sort of persuade people, but they tend to be better for sort of supporter audiences. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can use your money to reach your voters or to reach your donors.
One thing that I wanted to ask you with COVID, how did that affect your guys' work with the? Because I think that you're right that face-to-face interaction probably moves the needle more than just a random YouTube ad. How was COVID for you guys trying to deal with all of that?
Well, it had a huge effect because especially with Democratic candidates, a lot of our base audiences are best reached through sort of in-person conversations, and those in-person conversations can be really effective. And for most of our candidates, that wasn't an option because of COVID. So people had to get creative. There was a lot more virtual events to try to reach people, a lot more virtual house parties where you were getting neighbors to invite neighbors to try to expand your sort of person-to-person outreach. A lot of phone calls. Phone calls are a little tricky in this day and age because, I mean, I don't know, do you answer every phone call you get that it's a number you don't recognize? No. So, phone calls don't always have a high connection rate, but that's also another way to reach people. We also use a fair amount of text messages to reach people. In the past, that used to have a really high connection rate and everybody read them, but now everybody's doing it and it's starting to decrease the number of people that actually read them. But text messages are another way that we reach people. But, not everybody has a cell phone. And, phone calls actually are more effective with people with landlines than with cell phones because they're more likely to answer the phone. They also tend to be older audiences that are more likely to answer the phone. But there's all kinds of things like that we had to do. And I've had candidates get very creative and do things like virtual fun runs. And virtual cooking shows and all kinds of things, both for online fundraisers, but also town halls and events with experts to talk about issues that matter to the community to sort of get their message out. So COVID was very difficult. I'm hoping that it will be less of an issue in this year's races.
Definitely. Another question that we have is about not dealing with an incumbent from the opposing party, but dealing with a strong incumbent in your own party for whatever campaign you're running. How do you deal with someone who's, I guess, ahead of you in your own party?
Sure. That's also something that a lot of our candidates work with because a lot of our candidates are younger. And, sometimes you have, especially if it's a district that has, that's pretty lopsided for one party or another, you can have an incumbent that's been in that office for 10, 15, 20 years, which makes it hard to challenge because they've built up a large base of support and have strong name recognition and things like that. But I think the arguments to challenge them go right back to some of the things I discussed earlier, that if you have an incumbent that's not meeting your community's needs, sometimes that means that they're not responsive, that they're not doing town halls, that they're not talking to the community, or they're not reflecting community values, or maybe they're just not doing much of anything at all. That also happens, and that needs to be challenged. Or maybe they're voting wrong on a set of issues that you really care about. And I'm not going to lie, it's hard to unseat an ensconced incumbent, but it absolutely happens. I think everybody's probably heard of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and that was entirely a campaign that, quote unquote, wasn't supposed to win because it was against a very powerful, entrenched incumbent. So it absolutely is possible. It often means building up a real grassroots base of support and doing a lot of direct voter contact, so you are transcending the sort of money and name recognition advantage of an entrenched incumbent and going directly to voters. It takes a lot of work, but it's absolutely possible. And it's sometimes important because not always, some incumbents are fabulous, but some incumbents get a little get a little complacent and aren't doing the work that needs to be done and aren't sort of reflecting community values or community needs. And even if you don't win, sometimes a strong challenge kind of jolts them out of those behaviors and starts making them a better representative for you.
Understand. The next question is how or when is it too early to announce for that you're running for a campaign? I mean, I've personally seen sometimes people on Twitter, I guess Andrew Yang's a great example of someone who announced pretty early. Do you see advantages in that of trying to raise money before, bigger names get into it closer to?
So there are advantages to starting early in that, you have more time to raise money. It's also true when it's raising money and getting your name recognition out there and getting your name out there and known. The other thing that's true with raising money is that, when you ask people for money, if they give you money, you're going to want to go back to them and ask for more money. Like a certain chunk of the money you raise will always come from resolicited donors. And if you don't have enough time to do those resolicits, that limits the amount of money you can raise. There's also, when you're raising money, people that are just harder to get in touch with. And so it just takes more time to reach them and get the money possible. The other reason to start early is also one that you mentioned, is that sometimes that keeps other people out of the race. That if there's somebody that everybody knows is running and has established a good base and is doing solid work, that might make someone else think, maybe this is the year that I'm not going to run after all, which makes it a little bit easier when you have fewer opponents. And it just gives you a chance to build the infrastructure. I mean, one of the challenges that I have in my job are people that wait until like a filing deadline to start their campaign. And they're just starting too late. They're just starting too late to build up the volunteer infrastructure they need, to build up the fundraising base that they need. And it's just not enough time to get the work done. I think starting, 9 months to a year out is generally pretty good for most races. It's not necessary. People can win races in 5 months, 6 months, but starting out that long gives you a chance to really do the planning and really do the building that you need to be effective. There is such a thing as starting too early. For most like local offices, that usually means don't start before the last election ended. So for example, like if you were running for, I don't know, Tucson City Council, and you announced in October of 2020, you're not going to get any attention. You're not going to have, donors are going to be like, I have other things to spend my money on right now. Volunteers are going to be like, I have other things to spend my time on right now. That's not a great time to announce. The other thing that's true is that, especially for media attention, is that you can start doing campaign work before you do a sort of public press announcement. I mean, people will know, especially if you put up a website or put up a social media presence, but you can do, and people do fundraising and campaign building once they have a campaign bank account and have done whatever is legally necessary for that, even before they build that web presence. But even if you build the web presence, you can send out the press release that's, kicking off my campaign or having an event to kick off my campaign. You can do that whenever you want and whenever you think it's going to get more press attention.
I understand. One other question is, how do you deal with the spotlight of the, being out there in the public? I'm assuming, maybe a school board doesn't get as much running for that
Absolutely.
as much attention as maybe running for a state seat in the state legislature. So does Run for Something, I guess, provide, or are there other groups that provide how to deal with that spotlight?
Well, it's something that I talk to candidates a fair amount about, because it can be unnerving to suddenly have sort of your name and your persona, which I think is important to note, that your persona should be authentic to you, but it's not always identical to sort of who your partner sees in you or who your family sees in you. Again, it should be authentic. It really doesn't work in politics if you have a completely different persona than who you are. But it's unnerving to have sort of your name and your face everywhere. It can be. It also can be hard, as I said before, that people feel like they can say things to you, and they will say, I mean, there can be a lot of negativity. There can be some ugliness that happens sometimes in campaigns. There are definitely trolls. There are definitely people out there that latch on to candidates and just sort of bug them all the time with negativity. And all of that can be hard. But I think the word is more often unnerving than it is problematic, right? I mean, I have definitely had candidates that have run into racism and more systematic ugliness, but more candidates, it's sort of getting over the internal hurdles of having my name out there and having things out there. There are other things that I didn't get into today about vetting yourself. I mean, when you're thinking about running, it's important to sort of think about your online presence. And while, you know, you can't ever erase anything online, you can make it harder to find. So one of the things you should think about doing if you're thinking about running for office is going through your social media background. And, you know, it doesn't mean that something you're taking down is terrible. It just might not be quite the image that you want to portray in your campaign. And so doing some of that cleaning up. And like I said, you know, most of that stuff, if someone is really dedicated to finding it, they can be. But in most local races, there's not a lot of op research that's done, and that, you know, if there aren't people that are sort of digging into your history the way it would be if you were running for president. But it can be unnerving. And that's also why it's important to have support structures. I mean, we talked about sort of building up a kitchen cabinet, which is providing you with advice, but it's also providing you with support. And that's when I do coaching with candidates, that's also something that I do. It's sort of navigating the anxiety of running for office in the different forms that that takes.
Definitely, definitely. I think you're right. That support system in anything is important, especially in COVID times. But if you're fighting for civil rights, for example, or anything like that. My last question is, how can people be a part of Run for Something? How can, I know you put a lot of groups on there as well, but if people want to get involved and are thinking about it, how can they reach out to all of you?
Sure. So you can go to our website, runforsomething.net. We've got a whole bunch of resources on the website that allow you to sign up for you know, saying that I want to become a candidate. Also, all kinds of resources about running for office. We have a whole section of the website that is for specifically COVID stuff and running for office for COVID. You know, doing tactics and such for running for office during COVID. I took down the slide. I will send you, you are welcome to share my email address with anyone, and I'm happy to talk to them. There's a lot of groups out there. The other things that Run for Something does is that if you go to our website and sign up, you will be put into a pipeline that you'll get a series of emails about running for office and with resources about running for office. You'll also be invited to a conference call that we do one a week that covers some of the same things that I talked about today, but goes some more in depth about the people we endorse and what our endorsement process is like, and also just talks some more about, you know, what it takes to run for office. Again, some of it was a repeat of some of the things I've talked about today, but that's also another chance to ask for questions. And then we have really active social media presence, and you're always welcome to DM us on Twitter or to reach out through Facebook or Instagram with questions or with, you know, if you need specific information.
Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions, but other than that, was there anything else that you wanted to say? I know you just right now told us a lot about the organization.
I just would really encourage people to think about running. One thing that we do have is wherecanirun.net, which is a website that lists all of the offices. You put in the address and it lists all of the offices that are available where you live to run for, and you would be amazed. I think in 2020 there were 150,000 offices up for election in the country. So there are all kinds of things to run for, and you would also be amazed how many of those things, especially farther down the ballot, are uncontested, that whomever puts their name on the ballot is basically the person who wins. So there's all kinds of offices to run for, and all kinds of ways to have an influence on the community.
I appreciate that so much. And in the description on our Facebook video, we'll make sure to put the links for Run for
Okay,
Something
super.
and on the YouTube video as well. But if you watch this video later on and have any questions, your email will be there, but always feel free to reach out to CAIR Arizona as well. We're here to provide a resource for you. And that's what we want to do. Like we said, defend, educate, and empower is our motto. And this is part of that education and empower, right? It's about building the next generation that can improve the civil rights, not just for Arizona Muslims, but everyone as well. So thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing all this information. And thank you all for watching this. Like I said, any questions at all, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, take care.